Un.
Che mi apre Oli sotto, che radio? Non che radio. Che radio? Local Commons Panel. Laisse-moi mal causer que
Et envoyez-moi un WhatsApp. Numéro WhatsApp D77 97 32, vous besoin de nous là même là. Dans le camion hall, quand vous étiez là dans sa zone, là, on fait des solis, nous mettons là, nous mettons des affaires, interview, nous avons des sur le téléphone, nous avons des audio. It's really good. Yeah, man. We got the sound system here. How's it? It's the CEO himself, right? The guy himself. So everyone is here. Super Audit, Kigali Color Festival, live and direct, Loki Radio. Et si vous allez au Facebook, vous allez dans la loi, live au Facebook, si vous faites aussi live au Facebook. Et si vous voulez suivre nous, pas venir, vous mettez WhatsApp, D77 97 32. Si vous avez quelque chose que vous voulez répondre, aucune question que vous voulez demander, nous allons vous avec Bon Simon dans un instant. Mais après, dans la base, qui va la bonne C4? Mon petit autre bonne C4, hein? On va sentir beaucoup de choses, on va aller voir avec un Grant. On va faire aucun coup, on va faire Grant, allez, hein? On va faire aucun coup là. So même C4 là, si d'autres mots qui vont y avoir fait une manœuvre, des gens là, on va expliquer pour faire une manœuvre. On va ender, après, on a serré dans la vie comme ça, nous restons right? Non è sapere la vita, fine con camion hall, che da vita. E se non che possiamo avere un'ambiance anti-live avec Sapaya. Non è come sono, si va a fare dei chantants, si va a vedere ici adesso. Right here,
Ah bah problème. Olha que alguém pulsar lá. Good morning, everyone. We are going to proceed with our second activity. for this festival. It's a panelist whereby there will be specialists in coral restoration or environmental specialists to be part of the panel. So let me start to welcome the panel members, Dr. Nimal Shah, Mr. Chris Mason-Parker, Miss Sophie Belwy, and Mr. Rodney Catt. So I will ask you to join in front to start. Okay, Dr. Shah in the middle and the panelists in the bigger chairs. This est l'annonce pour bandi moun qui envie écoute nous session panel. Vous êtes capable de joindre nous en bas l'attente. Bon qui dans stall qui ont moins d'activité. Vous êtes aussi capable de joindre nous et voir un petit peu discussion qui pour passer. Moi pour faire une petite introduction. Après, moi pour passer mic avec Dr. Shah, l'équipe pour moderator for the this panelist session. Okay? So we start. I'm just going to give a little bit of background context in terms of what has happened in Seychelles. First, I'm going to start with the challenge. In 1998, a mass coral bleaching event severely impacted the reef of the Seychelles archipelago, leading to significant decrease in live coral cover. Despite effort, coral recovery has been slow, posing risks to economy and ecological balance. A second major bleaching event in 2016 further exacerbated the situation. Now, the world is currently experiencing its fourth global bleaching event, according to NOAA and NOAA scientists and the ICRI network. And also we have seen it firsthand in Seychelles. So it's a second bleaching in the last 10 years. Global bleaching event affect all coral reef equally and required a suite of global, regional, and local intervention. That is the challenge. Now, action. Nature Seychelles initiated the Reef Rescuers Project in 2010 to restore coral reef post-bleaching. Supported by USAID, the project involved coral gardening to raise and outplant healthy corals. The project aims to restore at least 1 hectare of degraded reef and cultivate thousands of corals by 2026, with a new phase focusing on scaling up and action and collaboration. The third, we have the partner, SPGA, MCSS, and we have the regional support from the regional project from Mauritius and Seychelles. So the third is research and development. The project aims to enhance scientific knowledge on coral restoration throughout collaborations with researchers of various institutions. Effort including study and coral restoration efficiency using underwater photogrammetry and testing artificial reef to increase biodiversity. The project is establishing a large-scale land-based nursery that is being headed by Nature Seychelles to produce thousands of coral colonies annually for restoration purposes and research. And the fourth theme is the success metrics. While long-term success is still being monitored, positive outcomes have been observed, including training practitioners from various countries in reef restoration techniques and establishment of successful coral restoration initiative. Ongoing effort aim to further enhance reef resilience and biodiversity. Now I have the pleasure of Dr. Shah to initiate the panel discussion. Dr. Shah, over to you.
Thank you, CEO. Welcome, everybody. I think that, as the CEO said, we are experiencing the fourth global coral bleaching event. This is not just something we read or see on CNN or read about in social media. It's actually happened in Seychelles. Most of the islands have been affected. Many corals have been bleached. We have divers in the water all the time, and they see this happening in front of them. Doesn't mean that the bleached corals will die, but many of them will. And for me, I would like to congratulate SPGA for this festival, but actually, this is not a time to celebrate because we have carnage going on in the marine world. And it's quite difficult to know what to do at this scale. As CEO Sidra said, Nature Seychelles, SPGA, and others have been trying to do their best. But it actually takes a national effort on what I call a war footing. Climate change is the biggest existential threat to ever hit this country. And we are actually, as a nation, not prepared for it. We are not really geared to fight it because we don't have the infrastructure or even the mentality to understand what's going on. It's very, very serious. And coral bleaching is just one part of the impacts of climate change. So today we have this eminent panel, and we've been given two themes. One is the status of coral reef ecosystems, where the panelists will discuss why coral reefs are important to the Seychelles and what are the primary threats facing coral reefs, not just coral bleaching. Then the second theme, which is quite important, is the search for what is being called resilient corals, supercorals, corals that have somehow adapted to the increase in temperatures. And there are several things to discuss here, and I hope that some of the panelists are doing work in this already, so they will be quite up to date with it. A third theme, which we have not been given, but if we have time, would be good to discuss, is funding and support, because without funding and support at a very large scale, it is impossible to deal with these large-scale events. So the first theme, the status of coral reef ecosystem, the first question, in what ways are coral reefs important to the Seychelles and its people? And the way that we want this discussion to happen is not just people talking, we want a conversation. So let's imagine we're at the boardwalk or another bar like that, and we're having a beer, and we're having a nice discussion. And as we have more beers, the discussion gets more interesting. So, Rodney, I'd like you to start with in what ways are coral reefs important for the people of Seychelles?
Hello. Hi. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Rodney Kat from the Department of Environment. I first started working with corals when I came back from my studies. I started with what was then SCMRT MPA, Seychelles Center for Marine Research and Technology, Marine Parks Authority, which eventually evolved the SPGA as we know it nowadays. So what's the importance of coral reefs for Seychelles? I think it's very important because one, our industry is mainly tourism and fisheries, and both of these, every day if you go to the Saint-Anne Marine Park, there are excursions going out, and one of the major activities, it's the snorkeling on the reef, to see the diversity on these reefs. And secondly, for fisheries, it's estimated that I think about 10% of the fish worldwide comes from reef, and if you come to smaller islands like Seychelles, it's even up to 60-70% of the fish that we consume comes from coral reefs. So not only is it good for food security, it provides a habitat for many species. In fact, about 25%, I think, of species, marine species, are on coral reefs. That's how diverse it is. It's considered as the rainforest of the sea. And then, of course, we also have other importance, which in Seychelles is not as popular now, but there are discoveries to be made on coral reefs where you can discover medicines or any other substances that can be used for medical purposes. And I think if you think about it, we've got about, what, 1,600 to 1,700 kilometers square of reef in Seychelles. And we are highly dependent on it. As much as we do not realize, we are very dependent on coral reefs. And with the continuous pressure from land-based pollution, from coral bleaching, ocean acidification, I think it's time we really sit down and have a chat about how we move forward and how we address this challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodney. I think that was very succinct. And I think it's a nice way you ended it, because now we can segue into the impacts on coral reefs. So maybe I can ask Sophie, what are the primary threats facing coral reefs in the Seychelles and also globally? Because we are living in a connected ocean. There have been recent maps that show that the oceans of the world are actually one ocean. They're all connected. It's all connected into one ocean. So what happens in other oceans affect us as well. So over to you.
Hello? Can you hear me? Yeah. I just wanted to add on to Mr. Katz's discussion about the economic value. According to the Nature Conservancy, we know that on-reef activities in the Seychelles generate over $50 million per year in the Seychelles alone. So this is extremely valuable to us, as well as we, as a country, we consume the third highest amount of fish per capita in the world, again, showing just our major dependence on coral reefs. But moving on to impacts, obviously we've said it time and time again, the climate change, the bleaching. We know that within a few weeks, coral bleaching can wipe out hectares of coral reefs, and the amount of time it takes to recover from those bleaching events is years and even decades, just to put that into perspective. We also have diseases that we need to think about. For example, in Aldabra, we have reports of the black disease. I'm not sure whether you have any more accounts of disease within the Inn Islands, but as well as we had an issue with crown of thorns, which can eat around a dinner-sized plate worth of coral reef within a year. I know we had a crown of thorns eradication program a few years ago. A survey found that the levels at which they were occurring were 20 to 30 times more than the sustainable levels. And in fact, I believe MCSS was the one who collaborated with multiple dive centers. They in fact removed over 1,000 crown of thorns. Yes, I think that's...
Yeah, I think that's a comprehensive view. And just to carry on with the crown of thorns, the thing with crown of thorns is that it's a naturally occurring organism. It can reach plague proportions. It has reached plague proportions previously. But now, get this, with very little coral, there's very few crown of thorns in the areas where there are very few coral. Like for example, on the Cousin Reef, we don't have crown of thorns. So I don't know if you've seen crown of thorns, Chris, in your areas. But where there's no coral, you won't get crown of thorns because they eat coral. So it's a crazy thing that's happening in the world. And as you said, rightly said, it can happen very quickly. When I was contracted to do the first National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan in '97, the groups of experts that were put together ranked the biggest problems according to a very simple ranking, 1, 2, 3, 4, with one the highest threat. Coral reef bleaching was ranked as the lowest threat because in '97 we had not seen coral bleaching. By the time the NBSAP was published, 3 months later we had a huge bleaching event. That's when people realized, wow, this is a major thing. So these things can happen very fast. Nations are not geared sometimes to meet these challenges. But I'd just like to maybe throw this at you, Chris, is what Sophie and Rodney said about the importance of coral reefs if they are so important to Seychelles, which they are, why is it that we are not gearing up everybody, and it's just a few organizations like yours and mine, SIF and SPGA, who are doing this work in silence, so to speak? Your opinion, please.
Hello. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Shah. Can I just start as well by saying congratulations to SPGA on organizing this event. I think it's very important, and it speaks to the question you just asked, Dr. Shah, is why are so few people concerned with what is an existential crisis for us here in Seychelles and globally? And I think a large part of it is coral reefs, for many people, remain out of sight. They're underwater. Not all of us snorkel or dive. Not all of us get the opportunity to see it firsthand. If we take the analogy of forests, for example, and imagine that on a global scale we were losing huge tracts of forest just overnight to some event that was happening more and more frequently, directly linked to climate change, there would be uproar. The whole world would suddenly be talking about it. We'd be trying to do something about it. But because it's underwater, because many of us don't get to access it or see it firsthand, it remains unpublicized to some extent. And it's down to those people that are directly involved in coral reef research, in restoration activities, to fly the flag for protecting these reefs. And that's why this is really important today, I think, having a festival like this where we can try and get the message out there. We can try and explain the work we're doing. And like Rodney said, and Sophia said, why it's so important to Seychelles in terms of our tourism industry, our fisheries industry, why it's important culturally, why it's important on a personal level to every single one of us, to our general well-being. So there's a lot more that we need to do, I think, to get the message out there. But it's really important that we keep trying to do so, and we keep banging the drum, because we're now at a critical stage.
Thanks, Chris. Anything else you want to add to what Chris said? I think he did a good job.
Just to add, I think maybe your question was why is not everyone on board?
Yes.
I think it's fair to say that unfortunately, probably more than 50% of the population do not know how to swim. So this is the first interaction you get with coral reefs. And I know in the past we've had youth dive clubs. And of course, there's always the issue of financing to support these activities, to ensure that we have the next generation coming up that will take up the fight, so to speak.
Yes, and also I think it's political will, because politicians don't usually put their heads underwater. I remember when a previous president of the Maldives had a cabinet meeting underwater. All his entire cabinet and him went diving and went on a coral reef to look at the problem firsthand. And I think that's the challenge, is getting the message across to politicians, decision makers, leaders, to make them understand this is not a problem for conservationists. Actually, it is not a problem for conservation, because it's happening. Other things, other ecosystems will take the place, whether it's sargassum, whether it's something else. But for people, it's a problem. It's a problem for people. It's a problem for us. We are a fish-dependent country. We are a coral-dependent country, but it doesn't seem that we are actually aware of that. Sophie, what do you think?
I think it's like Chris said. I think it's just the fact that it's less visible as an ecosystem.
Yes.
If more of the public went diving, went snorkeling, they would see the impacts like we see the impacts every single day. Obviously, when we're going into the water week by week, we can see the reefs we're familiar with actually bleaching, and it's very hard to relay that kind of severity and urgency to someone who doesn't normally see them.
Very good point. So maybe we should have more snorkeling and diving clubs offered to people, so they can go underwater. But people do see the impacts. People who've been around for some time, like me, with no hair or gray hair, who've seen beaches disappear. I would say 50% of the beaches that I would go to as a kid with my father to either snorkel off the beach or just go to the beach on a picnic are not there anymore. They've turned into rocky shores, or they've had a seawall built on them, or something like that. I mean, it's incredible. And this is one of the missions that I gave myself when my son was growing up, that I would take him to every beach on Mahe. And by doing so, I discovered some beaches were no longer there. The beaches I remember where my dad was a photographer, used to take pictures, no longer there. So these things, our heritage is disappearing right in front of our eyes. And as you said, what is tourism in the Seychelles? It's sun, sea, and sand. That's what it is. Tourists would not come here if we had black sands like the Comores or pebble beaches like somewhere in Europe. They come here because of the sandy beaches, the beautiful ocean, so forth. So with that, let's move on to the next theme, which is, okay, so the corals are bleaching. Many of them are dead or dying. We are trying to restore corals desperately. It's a desperate fight. It's a desperate battle. And sometimes we are not winning. Like in this period, now the waters have cooled down, but a month ago, we could see much of our restored reef dead or dying. So what is the next step? So the next theme is the search for resilient corals. What are the factors that influence a coral's ability to withstand the stresses? What role does genetic diversity play in coral reef resilience? Very important question that we may not think about in Seychelles because we don't think about this kind of scientific aspects of genes. And are there any scientific methods we can use to speed up the resilience of corals and the resilience of a reef, a coral reef, which is an entire ecosystem. It's not just corals, it's an entire ecosystem. Because when corals die, there's a desert. Why is there a desert? Because in tropical waters, you don't have a lot of nutrients in the water. That's why we have such beautifully clear waters. If you go to a lake or some areas in other places where there are a lot of nutrients in the water, either natural or man-made, like pollution, it's not clear. Tropical waters are naturally nutrient poor. It's the coral reef that is an oasis in this desert that provides a home and food and shelter for many, many, many organisms. So how do we increase the resilience of this ecosystem? Chris, you've been thinking about this a lot, I know, so please give us our thoughts on that.
Thank you, Dr. Shah. Yeah, it's a challenge. It really is. So, I mean, MCSS has been working on a regional coral restoration project along with Nature Seychelles and the Seychelles Parks and Gardens Authority for a few years now. And one of the things we're all looking for is to identify those corals that are potentially resilient to thermal stress, in the hope that when we do experience coral bleaching events, as we are at the moment, they'll survive. The difficulty is that the science is still not clear. There's a lot of variables involved in terms of what makes a coral resilient. It could be the algae, the zooxanthellae that is found within the coral. It's potentially also it differs from one species of coral to another. The life form of the coral. Is the coral in a shaded environment? What depth is it at? So there's a huge number of variables. And so I think the way forward for people undertaking research in this area, for ourselves and for the other organizations, is experimental. It's to look at, how can we look at different variables affecting corals and then take those corals for those traits and propagate them and use them for our coral restoration activities. So to give you an example, the work that MCSS is doing within the St. Anne Marine Park, we're taking corals from a number of donor sites, and we have one donor site in particular where the conditions aren't what you would expect to find a healthy coral reef in. They're very turbid, so the water clarity is very, very murky usually. They're close to the surface as well, so the water gets very warm. They're also very close to an urban environment, so we refer to them as urban corals, because they're subjected to nutrient loading, pollution, but they seem to do very, very well. And we've been using this site for donor corals for a number of years now. And as this current bleaching event is unfolding, and it's still underway, so I mean it's far too early to draw any positive or negative conclusions, but those corals that we have taken from this particular donor site seem to be doing very well still, while corals from other sites are bleaching, and there's already some signs of mortality. So moving forwards, it's going to be a case of looking at which corals have survived, and then trying to identify precisely why they have survived, drilling down into the reasons behind it. And then hopefully by doing so in future, we'll be much better equipped to undertake restoration activities and to hopefully restore larger areas of coral reef.
Okay, Rodney, do you think, given what Chris has said, that there's a lot of research to be done, there's a lot of uncertainties, there are areas of scientific research that are quite complex. Do you think that Seychelles has the capacity and resources to do all this? And what should we do?
Thank you. Fully agree with Chris. There's so much we still need to learn about corals, resilience of coral reefs. In terms of capacity, there is a big demand locally, be it in terms of human resources to train staff, the laboratories we need to set up. For example, we don't have any genetic labs. That is one of the most important things, because I think one of the things that's been proven is that the more diverse the reefs are, the better chance they have of surviving, because there's a bigger gene pool. So this means there's more chances for evolution of the best genes. And there are other simple little things. For example, post 98 bleaching, where we lost about 95% and more of the reefs, a lot of it is what we call branching corals. And so we had the bits and pieces of corals lying on the seabed, which we call rubble. And one of the difficulty for corals to regrow is they need a solid substrate. So what was happening was the corals they were starting to grow, and then as soon as the wave action comes along, they get destroyed. But I think over the years, this has improved. But unfortunately now, with the bleaching, we see this happening again. But the work that's being done in Seychelles is very good, especially for local sites. But I want to bring the idea of the bigger picture of ecosystems approach in terms of connectivity and marine protected areas. Because to me, it's just like a person. If you are a healthy person, you are least likely to catch a cold. Whereas if you're not very healthy, then you're more likely to catch a cold. So we have to put emphasis on protecting the whole system. So the seagrass beds, the coral reefs, everything that is connected with it, so that, because this is nature, it will develop its own resilience. So we need to make sure that on a bigger scale, we understand the connectivity between protected areas, because some areas you have what we call the seed and source, where you have the coral larvae coming from, and the areas where they deposit and grow. So as it's been mentioned, there's a lot we still need to do, a lot of scientific work. But I think we need, yes, the local approach, and of course the bigger ecosystems thinking approach.
Okay, good points. Sophie, what do you think of the idea that the ocean is connected? Everything is connected to everything else because it's a liquid medium. We can't just be looking at coral reefs. We can't just be looking at marine protected areas, because it's been shown in the scientific literature, and we know, because we see it, that protected areas don't really always are resilient to climate change. In fact, some of the first corals to be bleached were in highly protected areas like Cousin Island Special Reserve, where it was corals had been protected for 50 years. They bleached very rapidly. So how should we as a country, you think, be looking at the protection of the ocean as an entire ecosystem or as an entire place where all these things are connected, and they're connected very importantly to us as a people and to us as an economy?
Thank you. Yeah, like you said, we can't really look at individual reefs or individual environments as singular. If we take hawksbill turtles, for example, they will not stay in one environment. They will move from seagrass beds to coral reefs to the beach. Similarly, in marine protected areas, we have the spillover effect. So we protect one population, but they will migrate. They will move into unprotected areas. So yes, of course, everything is protected, is connected in a way. And as well as, I wanted to add to the point about genetic diversity. I think it's super important because with genetic diversity, we also have functional redundancy, which means that several species will be playing the same role, occupying the same niche. So an ecosystem itself will be less impacted if one species dies because we have multiple species carrying out that same role. So I think we should also be talking about how to increase genetic diversity as well as connectivity. For example, this festival, it's really nice to see all the NGOs in one place, collaborating, talking to one another. I'm sure we all have challenges and we can learn from one another as well.
You've actually brought forward a few new ideas. One is the whole idea of diversity, which is very important in biology. It's very important in ecosystems. Actually, it's the most important thing in life is diversity. Because without diversity, life becomes extinct. Everything is the same, and at some point, something happens like a disease or a perturbation, and that species goes. This is one of the problems we have with our endemic species. The birds, they're not diverse enough in terms of genetics. So if we have functional redundancy, as you say, is the approach that we are taking at the moment where we can only grow certain species of corals properly? And that's what we're doing. We've reduced the diversity because we either can't get to the other corals or they can't grow properly using the kind of methods that we use. So we're actually not restoring reefs. We are implanting ecosystems that are not the same as before. So my challenge to you is the word restoration the real word to use? Because we are not restoring coral reefs. We are not turning back the clock. We are putting there fewer species that there were before. Let us say there were 58 species on the reef of Cousin. We are now planting only 8 because only 8 will grow under these circumstances that we are growing them. So what do we think of this? Is this a good way to go, or should we start to look at other ways like we are doing at Nature Seychelles to grow more diverse or more species of corals in other ways, like for example on land, to be able to combat climate change? Or is it okay just to cover a reef and we say we have 80% cover, but there are only 10 species there, but we have 80% cover of corals? And the idea of restoration, I would like, Chris, you to pick up this idea of restoration. Are we restoring coral reefs, or are we restoring ecosystem services that coral reefs deliver?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and I suppose the way I look at it is it's the restoration activities we're doing at the moment. It's not the perfect solution, but it's better than not doing anything. We refer to the work we do as coral gardening, and I think a garden is a good example. If you have a garden, it will support wildlife. Not as much as an original piece of forest, perhaps, but more than a car park or a concrete building. So it will have some ecosystem services, some ecosystem functions. So I think in terms of the activities that we do, the coral restoration community, We predominantly choose species of coral like the branching corals that you see here on the table because they grow very well in nurseries. They grow fast. They're three-dimensional. They provide habitat for different species. But we are only doing a few species. We're not, I think there's over 300 species of corals found on Seychelles reefs, and we're limited to a dozen or more species that we're actually working with. So it's not the ideal solution, but branching corals like the acroporas, the poeciloporas, they're well known for having a boom and bust cycle. So they're the first to bleach when you have a bleaching event, usually the first to die, but they're also the first to regrow after a bleaching event and start to dominate the reef. So if we can start that process ourselves by growing and translocating these corals, then perhaps over time, other corals will settle and complement them on the reef, and then you'll have a more diverse reef build up over time. Now, of course, the elephant in the room is climate change. Historically, after a bleaching event, perhaps coral reefs had time to rehabilitate and to reach their former levels of diversity and coral cover. But the coral bleaching events are now becoming more frequent, they're becoming more severe, and this is hampering our ability to restore reefs in the way that we had previously.
So, Sophie, what do you think that there will be certain species of corals that will die out and we just have to accept that they'll be in aquariums or in places like that, and they can't cope with climate change. They just don't have the resilience until some new scientific method is found, like inoculating them with the right zooxanthellae or something, or tinkering with their genes. What do you think? Should we accept that there will be corals that are not there anymore, become very rare, and that we can't do anything about, and we just try to rehabilitate those that we can? It's a provocative question.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's a difficult question to answer. Like Chris said, coral gardening right now is not the perfect solution. Obviously, we have encrusting and massive corals that, how do we attach those to a nursery? But I will read research that says these species are more resilient than acropora and poecilopora, which is what we're mainly using. But like you said, you have the land-based nursery that could, technology is always evolving, so maybe we could start to spawn massive encrusting folios, the ones we can't do on ocean nurseries. We could start to look at land-based nurseries to start spawning them even. And there's things like probiotics. I know there's recent research on releasing beneficial bacteria to the corals that essentially scavenge the reactive oxygen species that they produce during thermal stress, as well as the recent papers on seabird guano that apparently help coral reefs through the supplementation of nitrogen. So we're always finding out new things, and technology will continue to advance as well.
Thank you. So if we're going to look at things like probiotics and all that with corals and tinkering with their genes and inoculating them with these dinoflagellates and these blue-green algae that they live in symbiosis with, that give them their color and their food, we come back to the same old question: how do we do it in a country of 100,000 people and with limited resources? Should we, or should the government actually, go all out to invite all kinds of scientists and researchers and universities to come to Seychelles to work, of course, work with local organizations to research some of these things, and we have the platform to do it. I know that there are quite a lot of people who come, but they come in isolation. They work in isolation. We call that parachute science. They parachute in, they do a little bit of work, and they go out, and they publish their papers. Should we, as a nation, have a better system where we bring these people to work with us and answer some of these very, very important questions to help us in our work? Questions that are not academic, but questions that will help us in our work. What do you think, Rodney, coming from government?
Um, I think you're right because in order for us to address this issue, it's going to take a collaborative effort from everyone, and we should pull resources from everywhere, as many resources from anywhere we can. And perhaps now I might mention that back in 2021 there was the coral reef policy, and now with funds from the Global Funds for Coral Reefs (GFCR), uh, part of the project is to implement what is in the policy. There are 13 thematic areas, but the main objective is to have sort of a national governance structure with all partners on board to see how we'll be able to first of all do the monitoring, then come up with possible solutions, and of course seek possible financing as well. Because as you may remember, Dr. Shah, we used to have the Seychelles Coral Reef Network, and that was quite a good platform for all coral scientists to collect information, and this was used for the publication in a global publication, which is a Status of the Coral Reef of the World, which we haven't done so in a while. So this is also part of the plan in the next coming year or two, is to try and use this coral reef policy as a base for us to start this collaboration.
That's a good point because I think all of us here contributed to the policy. But government policies are usually for government. And the issue here with this policy is mobilization of resources. Government always expects the private sector and NGOs to contribute their expertise, their hard-won knowledge, their time, which is money, free of charge to these things. And I'm sorry to say government civil servants get a salary. Many of us have to work to get a salary because we have to get projects, we have to do fundraising and so forth. The key here is financing, like I said. This is what we are missing. The third thematic area that was not given to us is funding, which I think is more important than anything else because what we're discussing remains academic unless we get resources. And I don't see the way global resources are going, it will help us. Because like, for example, the Global Fund for Coral Reefs that you mentioned, the GFCR, they are funding a profit-driven model so that they'll give very small funding and then the organization or the company which is supposed to do what they call reef positive activities, turn a profit and run off on their own. So we know that it's very difficult anyway to do some of these businesses in Seychelles. So it's very difficult for me to understand how we're going to get funding for coral reef research, development, and restoration through this kind of model. We must get other kinds of models, and not just small. There are organizations like SECAT which are already giving money, but it's small in terms of the impact, because these are huge problems. So somewhere along the line, government needs to have this political will to be able to mobilize massive amounts of funding, whether it's from government budget, whether it's from the private sector, through whatever mechanism they choose, to be able to fund this kind of stuff. Because you may have a policy which is, actually, that is an excellent policy, the coral reef policy, but you may not be able to implement it because you don't have the resources either in the ministry, in other parts of government, or in the wider conservation field. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, nationally, financial resource is always the priority question. Who gets more out of the budget? And I agree, just as maybe a lot of money I know is spent in waste management, we should start considering maybe a bigger chunk going towards conservation efforts. That I agree. But I also think we should explore all possibilities. And one of the ways we can do that is by getting back together, especially with the Coral Reef Network. Even if we have to have a special finance committee, just to think of ways to, because there is funding out there, but We just need to know which door to knock and how to present our case.
So yeah, that's a good point. We're running out of time, so I'll just go around and see if any of the participants have any closing remarks or any burning issues. Sophie, we'll start with you. Any burning issues that you haven't come out with? No, any closing remark?
Just happy to be on this panel with all of you because I know you guys have had many years experience and knowledge, so it's an honor to sit on this panel with you.
Thank you. It's nice to have you as well. Chris, any closing remarks?
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts. I mean, we're all going to go home today. At the end of the day, it's the weekend. We're going to have a nice weekend, and most people will have had a bit of time to think about what they've heard and seen today, but then they'll get back to their normal lives. Meanwhile, coral reefs will continue to face unprecedented stress. We'll be busy undertaking our monitoring and restoration activities. But as Rodney and Dr. Shah were discussing, we can only do this for as long as we do have finance to do it. And we're working currently under a project that has a finite period of time. In 2 years, the funding stops. And then, essentially, unless we can find supplementary funding, the project stops. And a huge amount of work, a huge amount of finances went into these projects. So we need to find a new mechanism to bring in funding, and not just large amounts of funding, because yes, we do need that, but it needs to be sustainable, it needs to be ongoing. And we need to find a model that permits that. So that might be from a variety of sources. But given the importance of coral reefs to Seychelles and to the people of Seychelles, I see it as coral reefs providing an essential service. And in the same way that we pay for everything else through taxation, perhaps there needs to be money coming from government to support coral reefs, which in turn support the tourism industry, the fisheries industry. Perhaps it needs to come from tourism levies. Perhaps it can also come from overseas philanthropists and donor funding. So there's various different methods and models that we can investigate, but I think we definitely need to look into it as a matter of urgency, and that would be the one message I would like to put out there, and is don't forget about the coral reefs of Seychelles, because we cannot underestimate their importance.
Well, just something I forgot to mention earlier. Just as an example, this evening after work, everyone will drive back home. So either via Okap or Northeast Point, and being high tide, you'll see that the wave is overtopping and ending up on the road. And part of the reason is because of the degradation of the reef just in front of these roads. So even if you're walking on land, the impact on corals still affects us. So essentially what I want to say, I think it's everyone's business to get into coral reef conservation. Not just coral reef, but the environment in general. And I think the only way we're going to achieve our objective is if everyone gets together, and of course, try to see how we can facilitate this as much as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we've heard some very interesting discussion. Sorry we haven't had time to interact with the audience. We were given some set questions and a set time. That would be nice. Maybe for the next panel, we have a round table where the audience can interact with us. But we still have about five minutes. Are there any questions or comments from the audience? I see a lady at the back. Yes. Can you give her a mic, please?
It is very encouraging to see you people around to talk about the coral reefs and all. But something else that we have to think about, do we, we grow coral in the nursery and then put out in the ocean? Are we thinking about the pollution that's from the land itself, because when you put it out in the ocean, at times it takes a while for pollution from the land to go back to the ocean. And when you sit back, you say, okay, it's growing. The corals are growing and everything. But anyway, that's my personal point of view. We should have a system about maybe in 5-6 years, we go back and see how is it going. Isn't there any adverse conditions that's affecting it? To enable us to push further into the research.
Thank you. That's actually a very good question. We haven't had time to debate it as what we call land-based sources of pollution. And in Seychelles, they've been significant. Many of us have seen when they built new roads, new housing estates, red earth plumes have come down and been in the water column for weeks. Back in the 90s, I remember when they were building their estate up at Oswayal, almost the entire bay of Oswayal was filled with red earth for many, many weeks. And I know that MCSS is facing quite some problems in the St. Anne Marine Park with pollution. Do you want just to say a few words on that, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, as far as the St. Anne is concerned, obviously it's not too far away from Port Victoria. And as we know, we also have a river outlet that flows into the harbor there. And after heavy rain, you have a lot of nutrients and sediments get washed out. And depending on the direction of the currents at the time, that can get put onto the reef. So, I mean, I think the thing that we can do is, I mean, we all know that climate change is the number one cause of the degradation of coral reefs through coral bleaching and rising sea temperatures. But there's things that we can do on a local level to reduce the threats to coral reefs. So that is like removing the amount of pollution that is going from the land into the ocean, making sure that we try and avoid any physical damage to coral reefs through anchors or through standing on the reefs, reducing fishing pressure on certain reefs. So there are things that we can do on the local level. There's obviously, you know, on a global scale, things are out beyond our control. But if we can give the local reefs the best chance of survival, then at least we're doing what we can. And picking up on the point the lady mentioned about monitoring, so I think that's something that all our organizations are doing. Once we put corals on the reef, we do go back later on and we see how they're doing and record data just to give us a better understanding of why it is that some corals are surviving and others aren't.
Thank you, Chris. I think that it comes back to the point that we can't only talk about coral reefs, especially on small islands. We are an island republic. Everything is connected to everything. That's why most of us are taking what we call a ridge to reef approach, mountain to mangroves to marine. It's all connected. Whatever happens upstream goes downstream and it ends up in the ocean. So this is why it's quite important to take a holistic view of the environment and try and tackle these issues, because actually what happens on land affects the ocean tremendously, but what happens in the ocean in terms of climate change impacts the land as well. The Indian Ocean is a very small ocean. It holds more heat than any ocean on this planet. So because it holds so much heat, the heat is being dissipated and you have more perturbations in the environment like cyclones, storms, quasi-cyclonic events, surges, even changes in waves and currents. Where we've been working on Cousin, on the coral reef there, the first part of the coral reef we had restored, we can no longer work there because of so much strong surges and currents. It's completely changed. So we've had to go to other areas to restore other areas. So things are changing dramatically because everything is linked to everything else. So I will leave you with that message, Thank you very much. Thank you, SPGA, for setting this up. I think we've had a very constructive discussion. I think the next one we'll have more time to involve the audience a little more. Thank you. Bye. Have a good lunch.
Thank you, panelists, the first for this morning. There will be a second panel at 1:30 this afternoon, and to conclude this activity for the day. But the general public are invited to come and see all the effort that the NGOs and government are doing in terms of restoration, coral reef protection, and other associated activities. Thank you.